Today's message comes from Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. Reading today from the New American Standard Bible, and the title of this message is May Not Work on All Snails. When they came back to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and some scribes arguing with them. Immediately, when the entire crowd saw him, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it." And he answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." They brought the boy to him. When he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. It has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help him." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him, and do not enter into him again." After crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out. And the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him up, and he got up. When he came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately, "Why could we not drive it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot come out by anything but prayer." If we were to read earlier in Mark, we would find that Jesus has sent his disciples out in pairs to minister to the surrounding communities. We would also find that the disciples have had successful ministries in healing those with infirmities and casting evil spirits out of those who are afflicted. It is while the disciples are engaged in ministry that Jesus had called Peter, James, and John, his inner posse. They went off with him on a side mission to go up to the mountain where the transfiguration takes place. Today's passage finds Jesus and the three other disciples who had accompanied him to the mountain, returning back to the village where they had left the rest behind. And there they find a lot of confusion when they get back. The disciples are surrounded by a large group of people, and in particular, there's a constituency of scribes who are directing a significant amount of sharp questions to the disciples who had remained behind. It seems that this assembly of people, and most likely the disciples in particular, are thrilled beyond measure to find Jesus coming back because he can likely answer the questions being raised. Jesus immediately turns his attention to the scribes, intervening much like a store clerk might intercede, as in the case of another clerk being verbally accosted by an irate customer. Now, essentially, Jesus is saying, there seems to be a problem here. Can I help you? Because obviously his disciples are in over their heads. And someone from the crowd speaks out, and because of the heavy involvement of the scribes, you can almost draw the conclusion that this incident may have involved a scribe's family member. The problem would seem to be that the son of one of the group is prone to seizures at inopportune moments. Matthew and Mark say that the son would at times throw himself into the fire or water, so we can almost infer a tendency towards suicide. Now, if this were a scribe's son, it might be even more of a matter of embarrassment on Junior's behavior than for the everyday person. So we get a feeling there might be a little more at stake going on here socially. You and your disciples have a reputation of being able to effect miracles of healing among the community, so I brought my son to you and your associates that his problem might be solved. Your disciples, however, seem incompetent or unwilling to address this situation and cannot seem to accomplish what I've asked of them. If they can do this for other people, why are they holding out on me? Is it because I'm a scribe and we've had our differences in the past? You can almost picture Jesus rolling his eyes and shaking his head and muttering, "How long do I have to put up with this shortage of faith on your part? What would happen if I weren't here? What will happen when I'm not here? Let me see the patient." As if on command, the son is thrown into some manner of seizure, and Jesus inquires more deeply into how long the son has been predispositioned to this condition. By now, the father is at the point of begging, and Jesus tells him, "If you have the capacity to believe, then all things are possible." To which the father tearfully replies, "I believe. Help me where I am short in belief." Jesus then casts the evil spirit from the son, and all are amazed at what has just happened. And as the crowd breaks up, the disciples finally corral Jesus off to the side and ask, "Master, what's the secret? You just succeeded where we failed. What did we do wrong?" And Jesus replied, "It's not that you didn't do it right. It's just that you didn't do enough. Sometimes you have to go the extra distance to get where you're headed." Probably about 8 years ago, when our oldest daughter was living at home with us, she decided to get involved in something I've always enjoyed tinkering with myself, keeping an aquarium. We had worked hard on the chemistry of the water, adjusted the pH, the hardness, the trace element presence, did everything to the best parameters for the health of the fish. The result was the fish was thriving. But shortly after that, something else happened. I like to establish an aquarium that becomes balanced and self-sustaining as an ecosystem. There becomes a relationship with what is in the tank. The fish consume food, pass out the waste, and they process gases through their gills, removing the oxygen that they need to breathe and expelling carbon dioxide as a byproduct. However, keeping only fish in a tank will soon result in a fouled tank that becomes toxic to the inhabitants of that tank. When you place live plants into an aquarium, they consume fish waste and process the carbon dioxide back into oxygen. It is possible to achieve a cycle wherein the fish and plants benefit each other, and the tank helps to maintain its own health and sustain the life that was within it, sort of like the balance that God instilled in creation. Primarily, we purchase our fish and plants at a shop that specializes solely in pets because that's what they do as their business. Now, on occasion, variety type stores will try to fill any demands that are out there to make money on it. But when the objective becomes to only make money and your employees are also putting new tires on cars, prescriptions in your medicine cabinet, clothes on your back, and food on your table, they tend to be a little lax in specialized areas like taking care of tropical fish. I want to reiterate that we actually had a pretty balanced aquarium going. And one day our daughter happened to be at one of these variety type stores, and while there, she decided to go ahead and get a few new plants for the aquarium, which we had planned to do. She purchased the plants, brought them home, and planted them in the aquarium. And for about 2 weeks, everything appeared fine. But then one day she said to me, "Dad, I think I've got a snail in the tank." And sure enough, there was a snail in her tank, albeit a rather small snail. And process of elimination led us to the conclusion that the origination point of the snail had to be the new plants. I told my daughter if it was just the occasion of one small snail that had stowed away on the new plants, it would not be too big of a deal. However, if the new plants were carriers of snail eggs, we were probably going to have trouble. We watched over the next few weeks, and the snail we had seen earlier was the only suspect, and its greatest crime seemed to be that it was growing larger. But one day, upon closer examination, lo and behold, there were three very tiny snails also in the tank. And the next day, there were another three snails. And the next day, another five snails. In a short matter of time, we literally had hundreds of snails in the aquarium, and the numbers were escalating daily. As the army of snails grew, the size of the number of our plants began to shrink until all but one plant was gone. Finally, we went to the pet shop to see what we could do. And there on the shelf was a bottle of chemical treatment for snails that contained copper, which is supposed to have an ill effect on snails. We came home and put in the dosage as prescribed. Later that day, I sat down and read all the fine print on our snail medication. There were cautions on using the chemical in the presence of plants and scaleless fish, as they might be detrimental to them as well. If after the treatment some snails were still evident, you should change out half the water and do another treatment. But in very tiny print at the bottom, there was a final disclaimer. May not work on all snails. Pessimist and usually correct realist that I am, I thought, oh great, we've got the snails that this stuff won't work on. And sure enough, in the allotted time for the treatment to have had effect, nothing happened. So we replaced half the old water with new and did a second treatment of snail medication, this time at double strength. And again, nothing happened. We now knew we were up against a pretty formidable foe. For the next course of action, we removed all the fish out of the aquarium and transferred them to temporary quarters. We then drained as much water out as we could and replaced it with water as hot as we could get it. We then put half the bottle of the copper medication solution into the tank, and for good measure, we added half a container of table salt because freshwater snails and slugs don't tolerate salt well. We then circulated that briny concoction through the tank and the filters for 2 weeks, stirring the gravel daily. And after 2 weeks, we repeated the entire procedure that I just described, and we gave it another 2 weeks to season and cure. Finally, we drained all the water out of the tank and removed the gravel. The gravel was subjected to a thorough rinsing under scalding hot water. The tank was washed out with hot water, wiped clean with straight vinegar, rinsed again with hot water, and we then began the process of reconstructing the tank. All went well now, and any trace of snails had disappeared. There are prescribed remedies to many problems, but sometimes to achieve the maximum effect, you must be willing to go an extraordinary distance. To deal with the snails, it did not end with merely placing drops of a copper solution into the water, because that is not enough to work on all snail infestations. Some snail infestations involve hot water, salt, vinegar, new filters, time, and effort. To deal with some evil spirits, as in today's scripture, it did not end with merely saying the right words or being there. Some evil spirit infestations involve prayer and fasting. There are times when the problems that we face will not go away if we just think about them, or even worse, refuse to think about them. It is one thing to claim that you believe, but do you believe enough to put some ownership into it? Do you believe enough to invest into it? We claim that we have faith in God. Do we have the faith that invests itself in getting to the end results? Faith is more than the words we say. Faith is how we live into those words every day. Jesus said, if you can believe, all things are possible. And like the Son's Father, we say, I believe, help my unbelief. If all things are possible, are we willing to go that extra mile that it may take in prayer and fasting? Do we want it bad enough to live past our words and into what we actually do in God's will? We say that we believe, but how committed are we to that belief? Yes, God can do all things. Just remember, he also works through his servants to get those things done. Today, churches have plenty of things to come up against. We face things that we did not have to deal with 50 or 100 years ago. Things like being displaced as the center of the community, complying with safe sanctuary issues, dealing with hostile attitudes from society, or competing with an entire list of other things to do on a Sunday morning. And now we've added the complications of readjusting to a post-COVID-19 world. Our answer may involve more than the quick fix in a bottle because we're trying to cope with require more than we are used to applying. Are we committed to going the extra mile? There are going to be some opportunities for you to serve in the church in new capacities that the church had never dreamed we'd have to consider doing. We are entering into a new world, and the church needs those willing to help the church reopen into a new reality. With God, all things are possible, but God often needs our cooperation for the possible to happen. And today, the church is going to need you to step up in cooperation and help us so that we can get back on our feet. We don't know just when that's going to happen. We're hoping very soon. But when it does happen, we need to be ready. We are going to ask the congregation to be willing to go the extra mile. Are you with us?